Perfect. Okay. A few people are dribbling in still, so we'll expect them to keep joining as we go. But thank you for those of you who are here so far. So I can see a lot of names who've joined us in some of the previous conversations that we've had. So thank you once again for coming back. And thank you to viewers who are joining us live on YouTube as well, and anybody who will be watching the follow-up recording on our YouTube page as well. So this is a Counter-Extremism Project event. My name's Liam Duffy, a London-based advisor for the Counter-Extremism Project. I'm sure, looking down the list of names, some of you know me. Probably a good time to say that I played rugby for the first time in 2 years on Saturday, thanks to COVID, and I bumped my head and have a bit of a concussion. So, Mr. Professor Kepel, if I start blabbering, that's why. Mary Kate's going to come in and save me. So that's the bad news. The good news is, with my concussion, I get to try and hold a conversation with one of France and one of the world's leading academics, intellectuals, and scholars on jihadism. So absolutely delighted to have a very busy man, a man who's very in demand, Professor Gilles Kepel, with us today. You can see the list of books. He's one of the most prolific authors on jihadist terror and political Islam. You can see some of the books in the background there. Terror in France came out a couple of years ago. Thoroughly recommend. And Away from Chaos was one of the more recent ones in English. And I believe you've just had The Prophet and the Pandemic, which is soaring up the bestseller charts in France and has just been translated into about a half dozen languages as well, I think. So we should be looking out for that imminently. But Professor Gilles Kepel, bienvenue.
Hello.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. Just for the people who are in the audience, so we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then you should be able to ask questions to the panelists. So as we get going, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to put them in there. But we're going to be talking about all sorts of different topics, and as well, as I mentioned in the promotion for this, on Professor Kepel's new kind of working hypothesis about the new generation of terror that we're entering. So France has obviously been in the headlines, in global headlines a lot recently, because we've had a flurry of terrorist attacks, kind of really kicked off with the failed attack on the former Charlie Hebdo offices. And then obviously, I think the one that really grabbed the world's attention in the middle of countries dealing with the COVID-19 crisis was the brutal murder of Samuel Paty. And then obviously we had the Nice attack and just an attack last week as well. So I think my first question is it fair to say that France has kind of usurped or replaced the United States as the kind of main animus or target of Islamist and jihadist rage?
Well, yes, to an extent. It also replaced the Britain of Salman Rushdie. When Erdogan played entrepreneur of rage or entrepreneur of wrath against France in the fall, after he had re-Islamized the Hagia Sophia by the end of July, it reminded me of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989, after the famous or infamous fatwa against Salman Rushdie on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 1989, where he targeted Mrs. Thatcher, he targeted Britain, and he decided that Rushdie had to be put to death for blasphemy, which was the beginning of all that thing. Originally, it was a Shia issue. It was Khomeini disputing the leadership of the Muslim world to the Saudis, and also because the Saudis, the day after, the 15th of February 1989, had achieved, with the help of the CIA, something huge, i.e. They managed to expel the Red Army from Afghanistan, thanks to jihad. And so Khomeini pulled the carpet under their feet. By the same token, in this summer and fall, Erdogan wanted to pull the carpet under the feet of the Saudis. After the Abraham Agreement, the Muslim Brothers and the Iranians tried to be sort of have the hegemonic discourse on Islam, and targeting France, targeting Macron as an Islamophobe was something that had a number of aims simultaneously. On the one hand, Erdogan wanted to get rid of secularism in Turkey, which is called laïque from the French laïcité or laïque. And originally, Atatürk thought of secularism in Turkey in its French dimension. If you go visit the mausoleum of Atatürk in Ankara, there is the volume of the social contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in French with annotations in French from Atatürk's hand, right? And Erdogan wanted to get rid of that. He wanted to erase this part of the Atatürk legacy in order to Islamize the state. And he chose to do that very wittingly on the 24th of July, because this was the day, the anniversary of the Lausanne agreements. This is the military Atatürk who fought against the Europeans after the end of World War I, and who sort of carved a territory for Turkey again, for the Republic of Turkey again, after the Europeans, the victors of World War I, had wanted to carve it into pieces. And this is why he behaved like that. And I believe that for Islamists worldwide, and particularly for political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, who are now on the offensive in Europe with Erdogan's and backing and Qatari backing, this issue of secularism is their prime target. So we had the trial of the Charlie Hebdo murderers that started in September, together with the murderers of the hyper kosher supermarket and of 2 policemen. Well, the actual murderers had been eliminated, but their accomplices and everyone, everybody who was indicted in this affair was standing trial. But then this was impossible to, this could not be heard worldwide, because the magnitude of the attack of the so-called Islamophobia, French Islamophobia, was such that what the French had tried to do, i.e. to put jihadists on trial and to differentiate between jihadists and the vast majority of French Muslims, that France is the biggest Muslim country in Europe, of Western Europe, in terms of absolute numbers, was inaudible. Because also, I believe, and this is the fault of the West, and particularly in Europe, the fact that the study of Arabic has gone down tremendously, does not really allow Europeans today and Americans to another extent to communicate and to with the Muslim world. When, for instance, when President Macron made his famous speech on October 2nd in Les Mureaux, which is a little city in the outskirts of Paris, and a policeman was stabbed to death with his wife that came out of this police precinct on the 13th of June 2016 by a jihadist, by an ISIS type who just came out of jail at the time. When he made this speech targeting what he called Islamist separatism, then you had not only the Erdogans and the like and the entrepreneurs of rage in the Muslim world who would mobilize, saying, hey, you're stereotyping Muslims and singling them out, but you also had that predictably in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, but also in the Financial Times. So it shows, the real difficulty in fighting the media war and fighting the war for Muslim minds, if I may say so. And all the more so as, when Macron used this phrase, this Islamist separatism, actually this is something that comes out directly from the Salafi and the political Islam worldview. It is something which is called in Arabic al-wala wal-bara, which is the slogan of the Salafist. Al-wala means obedience only to the most rigorous, the most Salafi of Muslims, with the most literalist people who analyze and interpret the sacred text, the sacred scriptures of Islam. And al-bara'a means that you make yourself, quote unquote, innocent from, you disavow yourself from any relation with whoever does not abide by this wala, i.e. the bad Muslims, quote unquote, the apostates, the infidels, and so on and so forth. And this is how those people view society. It is fractured. You have the chosen ones, you have the so-called good Muslims who do not abide except on lip service with the law, the morals, the cultures of European societies. And then the rest of them are either apostates or unbelievers or infidels. And this, in a way, was a means to identify the kind of threat that he thought that we were facing. And actually, what we saw during the fall of 2020, with the 3 attacks, the one by this Pakistani guy, immigrant Zahir Mahmood, who looked on his cell phone at a big demonstration in Pakistan with people having cutlasses over their head and who were asking for the beheading of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. And the guy went and bought a meat cleaver, because this was what looked like a cutlass, and went on the internet, tried to find what was Charlie Hebdo's address. He made a mistake, and he assaulted 2 people who had nothing to do with that, who fortunately were not killed. Then you had the Chechen Anzorov, who decapitated Professor Samuel Paty, after there was a smear campaign on the internet against him by those entrepreneurs of rage, people who did not say kill him, but who said, hey, this is an enemy of Allah. And this became viral on the Islamist web. And then suddenly the self-styled jihadist Abdullah Anzorov decided to take the matter into his hand and behead Samuel Paty. Then we had the guy who was a Tunisian illegal immigrant who had just crossed over into France illegally from Italy a couple of days before, and who stabbed 3 people to death on the 29th of October, which was the day of the Mulud or Maulid Nabawi, i.e. the anniversary of the birth of the Prophet this year, in the Nice Cathedral. And the guy had a photograph of Anzorov in his smartphone. This is the only thing we know. So this is a new stage, if you wish, in jihadism. It's not like Al-Qaeda, where you have the pyramidal system, a sort of Leninist organization where orders are given to executives. People are sent to take flying lessons in America. It's not anymore of the sort of ISIS model, which is network-based, bottom-up, as opposed to Al-Qaeda, which was top-down, and where you have people who are manipulated through, for instance, Telegram or whatever networks, who are made to, who are given orders to attack someone or kill someone. This is what we saw with ISIS everywhere. This is different. This is new, and this is much more worrying, because the security offices and administration and forces are not accustomed to that. You have this, what I call this atmosphere of jihadism, which is widespread on the web, which targets people, singles out people, and then, but they, you cannot criminalize them, because they are not asking for anyone to kill anybody, but they just say, hey, this gun is a bad person. He is hostile to Islam, and then someone takes it into his hands. This is what I call atmosphere or atmospheric jihadism, and this is a hypothesis which I published in this book in French. We can find it in English in this excerpts that Liberties Journal just published. And unfortunately, this was to a large extent confirmed last week, because we had another occurrence in the outskirts of France, not far from the place where Samuel Paty had been beheaded, when a Muslim man, stabbed this lady who worked as a clerk in a police precinct. She was not a policewoman. She had no uniform. She had carried no weapon. And we were fortunate enough, in a way, to have access to his whole Facebook page, which runs 10 years to 2011. So this was extremely interesting because thanks to that, you could reach out to the whole Weltanschauung, if I may say so, of the killer, who was not a jihadist at all, who was not socialized in a jihadist milieu, but who was a follower of Islamist discourse and of a radical Islam discourse, a political Islam discourse, but he was not into killing infidels. He was fascinating also, but what we call here the Islamo-Leftists in France. I mean, leftists who are on the side of the Muslim Brothers, and suddenly something happened, and he decided to stab this woman during Ramadan, after he had a sort of crisis of exacerbated piety. And this is, I believe, one of the biggest challenges that we're now facing, because this is a new model. It was tested in France, but it also took place in Austria to a large extent, in Vienna on the 2nd of November, the day before Joe Biden was elected in America. And this is, I believe, the major challenge that we have to face in this field nowadays.
So we'll talk a bit later about the atmospheric jihadism model, because I think is a much better way of understanding some of the things that we say about these lone actor terrorist attacks. You mentioned the entrepreneurs of rage, and I know you've actually been the target of one of those kind of campaigns against, calling somebody an Islamophobe and kind of enemy or opponent of Islam. And I know it's not a comfortable place to be, and I know several people who have been on the receiving end of those kind of campaigns as well. What I was going to ask you about was, you mentioned the New York Times and the Washington Post and everything. I mean, it struck me that they were kind of amplifying what the entrepreneurs of rage were saying. This caricature of France and things like integration in France and France's alleged colonial history and things like that. What is it the Anglosphere gets wrong, and why do you think they were kind of amplifying the grievances that were being levied against France, rather than, I mean, a lot of these grievances are quite illegitimate in my view. They're quite conspiratorial and reaching quite far back into history and very one-sided. Why were the kind of, if I dare I say it, the liberal American press tended to be on the side of the entrepreneurs of rage?
Well, the funny thing is that originally, this came out of France, because this came out of what is called on American campuses French theory, i.e. Foucault, Derrida, Bourdieu, and others. And this was sort of repackaged and made a mass media product by American culture and sent back to us to a large extent. Except that when Bourdieu, Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze were thinking about that, they were not thinking in terms of political battles. And this has been taken into hostage by the battles within American campuses and re-exported worldwide, and also through the US media. Many journalists are now young and wherever in the world, because they are not very well paid. So this is a beginner's job. And I believe that this is what is called, the sort of cancel culture, or the woke culture in English. This has to do with a change in European and Western and American societies, where in the past the criminal, when I was a teenager, this is way back in the 1970s, The monster was the Nazi regime, was what we came out of World War II. Then the other simultaneously was the communist world. And nowadays, the other, also because the population, due to immigration, the population of Western countries has changed, is the colonial past of France, of Britain, is the history of slavery in America. And so the elites have to pay the price for the past, the crimes of the past. Hence, whoever is a scion of the populations who immigrated from countries who had been colonized, who had been under colonial yoke, or who had been enslaved in America, has a sort of innate legitimacy. And then whoever is white, or whoever is someone who belonged to a former colonial country is ipso facto incriminated. And this has created some sort of strange essentialist clusters, if I may say so, where you do not identify people by what they think or their ideology, but from their essence, from the color of their skin, from their religion, and so on and so forth, which creates a fragmented society that is extremely difficult to deal with. And when there was a left-right struggle or a class struggle in Western politics, then you could always imagine that a member of the proletariat could become a bourgeois, or even vice versa. When you're clad into an ascribed identity, then there is no possibility for democracy. There's only a future of struggle, which will end with the defeat of one and the victory of the other. Which is a major problem for us nowadays.
So actually that leads quite nicely into what I wanted to ask you about. So I think it was a day or two after the Nice attack, so maybe 2 weeks after the Samuel Paty murder, you were one of 100 or so academics who signed a manifesto or a letter. I think it was in Le Monde, kind of denouncing these decolonial or identity-based ideologies. And I mean, I guess it's two questions really. One, how do you see those as linked to the jihadist attacks that we saw? And secondly, why is it that France is able to, France's kind of intellectual sphere is able to put up much more of a resistance to these ideas than what is happening across the Channel or indeed across the Atlantic? It seems as, these ideas have just kind of been wholesale adopted in my country without much challenge. But there's a serious debate going on in France that isn't happening elsewhere, I think.
Well, I believe, part of the French history was based on a concept which was very much under attack recently, which was assimilation, i.e. France, as opposed to many other European countries, was not a country mainly of emigration, but of immigration. When Brits, Italians, Spaniards were fleeing their country because of poverty and were going to the US, to Australia, to Argentina, or what have you, France did not have much of an emigration. And on the contrary, received people from everywhere, not only from the former, at the time, the French colonial empire, but also from Eastern Europe. Like, for instance, my family and my father's son came from former Czechoslovakia, which was the Austrian empire at the time. And the idea was, in a way, just like in Athens in the 5th century BC, that you were not Greek because you had Greek blood, but you were Greek because you had been in the gymnasium or in in the palestra. You learned the language, and then you were imbued with the culture. And whatever the color of your skin, of your religion, and this was the issue in the French understanding of secularism or laïcité. As long as you shared the culture, you were considered a citizen. And you know, for instance, in Britain, there's this difference between a nation and the citizenship. You can be Welsh, you can be Irish, you can be British, you can be Scottish, which is now becoming a problem. But it's not the same as being British. You can become British, but you cannot become Welsh, or you cannot become Scottish. In France, there is no such difference. You can become French, and you're welcome to become French. Now, what is the counterpart to that? That you consider that you belong to a society, the tenets of which you do not challenge. You can be a leftist, you can be a rightist, you can be a Republican, a monarchist, or whatever you want. But this issue you cannot challenge. And then with the decolonial movement, the indigènes de la République, as they call themselves, people who think that they are treated now that they're on the soil or the turf of the French Republic, just like their ancestors were dealt with in the empire, in the French Empire, in the colonial empire, or in whichever empire, British, Dutch, or Italian, or whatever. Then you had the colonists and the natives, right, indigènes, the indigenous people. And so they consider that they are not real citizens, they are just the signs of the natives, and that they have to fight against the French state today, just like their ancestors or their forefathers fought against the colonial yoke, and that led to independence, right? So this is something that tears the very fabric of society. And the reaction against those movements did not only come from right-wingers, but from actually the most blatant critics of those movements are people who belong to what we call the Universalist Left, if I may say so, or what in America they might call the colorblind left, if you want. Left. And those were the people, many of them, who signed the manifesto that you mentioned. Many of my colleagues and myself, I mean, have always been on the left side of French politics, if you wish. And now we feel that we're caught between the hammer and the anvil, between, on the one hand, the sort of the identitarian, as they call themselves, of the French extreme right, and the identitarians of the French left, allied with the Islamists. And this is why there is such a strong debate. I believe that we're going to have a presidential election the campaign is going to start in the fall, and the presidential election is due in June 2022. As of now, the two candidates should be President Macron, who will run for re-election, and Marine Le Pen. And with she's a very strong contender now, because others have disappeared. And this is what, campaign may be polarized on those issues, together, of course, with the COVID-19 and its sequels, as is the case everywhere.
Mm. Well, it strikes me that, I mean, you mentioned what might be called the colorblind left in America, for example. Like I mean, this is just my own personal opinion, but part of the reason you've seen such a response from the center left in France is that actually, when you think about those universalist kind of liberal values, this identity-based vision of the world is quite incompatible with that view. So really, the kind of that terrain being left by the center left or liberals has actually given the opportunity for the extreme right and the far right to capitalize, and especially on things like jihadist terror or Islamist extremism, the inability to talk about or the perception that they're openly allying with Islamist groups I think has given the far right an entry point into mainstream politics. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely, and vice versa. Because when you read back, the famous manifesto by Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, the call for global Islamic resistance, then he advocates, attacks, haphazard attacks on Europe, wherever. You don't have to to do a remake of 9/11 because it's too complicated. But you should have a multitude of stabbings of if you can kill soldiers, policemen, Jews, or apostates, bad Muslim, this is great because these are easy targets, they're soft targets. Then the global society will be exasperated and will turn against Muslims in general. There will be pogroms, and so that will allow jihadists to rally Muslims under their banner as the best defenders of Muslims. And this is what we just saw this weekend in France when Marine Le Pen and many in the extreme right, because this guy had illegally immigrated into France and had been regularized 10 years after he came. He was a delivery boy and he had a job, he was working. And they said this is the fault of immigration, of immigrants. They did not, some did not say it, some said it, it's Muslims in general. Because when, I looked at the Facebook page of this guy, as I mentioned to you, and he was not a jihadi. I mean, he was someone who was an observant Muslim, fascinated by those Islamo-leftists in France and by political Islam. He had Erdogan, he had Mélenchon, he had all those guys in his page, Ghanouchi and the others. So they said, no, it's not. He was not a jihadi. He was a Muslim. So Islam is the problem. So you have that on the one hand, with the extreme right who's capitalizing on that, on jihadists, and jihadists who are capitalizing on that because say, see, we are discriminated. We're fingers are pointing at us because we're Muslims. So we jihadists, we decolonialists are the only ones who are able to defend this constituency, your constituency, which is based on race, color, creed, and everything. And this is what this is the challenge that we're facing. And this is clearly something to which a number of people in the sort of universal center left in France and a number of scholars, intellectuals, and the like want to react. They don't want to be caught into this trap.
Mm. No, it is a trap. I think a lot of people, I don't know, on this side of the channel are feeling like they can't really say what they think or can't really criticize it for all sorts of fears. But anyway, so just before we get onto the atmospheric jihadism, so I think there's been a massive change in France in the perception of jihadism in recent years. So obviously Macron has given those speeches about Islamist separatism that obviously received a mixed reaction. But I think a few years ago, even 2014, 15, as quite high numbers of French citizens were heading to Syria to join ISIS, I think, was it David Thompson, the journalist, called it jihado-skepticism. There was a kind of denial about what was happening, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. But now this seems like this is a very mainstream debate in France in a way that it's not in other countries. And I know that, people like yourself and I think Hugo Micheron's work and Bernard Rouget's work have really helped to lead that conversation that way. But can you just describe the change from jihado-skepticism to where we are, that mainstream conversation now?
Well, when thousands of young Europeans went to Syria under ISIS, originally, many of them, say in 2012, 2013, would go there with the blessing of European powers, because at the time, Bashar al-Assad was perceived as the enemy of mankind, and he was going to fall. And at the time also, if you remember, Erdogan was perceived as Mr. Nice Guy. by Barack Obama. The Arab Springs, or the so-called Arab Springs, were perceived from Washington as something which was okay because a number of dictators had been toppled, but it could lead to turmoil, and the ones who could put things back on wheels were the Muslim Brothers. And so there was a sort of engagement with the Muslim Brothers by a number of leaders in the West at the time. And with this, I believe people would not pay attention to the changes that were taking place, for instance, in the Syrian rebellion. Originally, the Syrian rebellion was controlled by Democrats or by former officers in the Syrian army, but increasingly it became more and more Islamists, and then more and more jihadists. And you know, for the Western governments to understand the magnitude of the change, it took a lot of time. Like, for instance, to give you another example, on European soil this time, in 2012, we had the Mohammed Merah's attacks in Toulouse, who killed soldiers who he thought were Muslims or apostates, who he dubbed apostates because they had brown skin. Some of them were not Muslims at all. They were French Caribbeans, but he thought that they were Muslims and that they deserved death because they served under the infidels' uniform. And also he killed Jewish kids in a school in Toulouse because he thought that, you know, young Jews would one day or another became soldiers in Israel, and then they were enemies of Islam and had to kill them. At the time, the head of French intelligence, of internal French intelligence, said that those guys were lone. Merah was a lone wolf, which was a total misunderstanding of what was happening, because he was socialized. This was, you know, this was the first occurrence of the ISIS mentality the first implementation, if you want, of the ISIS doctrine that emerged out of the two Abu Musabs, Abu Musab al-Suri for the European branch, and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi for the Levant and the Iraqi thing, which merged in a way into what would become the so-called ISIS caliphate. And this was not understood to a large extent because the expertise of European and American intelligence agencies was not up to par, because, you know, most of those guys do not read Arabic, don't have a culture of what is happening now in Islam, and what are the changes, what are the challenges. And this has been one of my thoughts, and I'm, you know, as we say in French, I'm preaching in the desert for that we know Arabic better. Not because the issue is to necessarily to spy on what, or to eavesdrop on what is being said in mosques, but also because this is a very important tool to understand that the magnitude and the wealth of Arabic or Muslim cultures with an S cannot be reduced to jihadi or Salafi Weltanschauung or worldview of preaching, if you want. And if we're not equipped with that, I think we're in trouble, because we're dealing with caricatures of our adversaries, and we're keen not to understand them. Whereas they understand Western societies much better because they are part of them.
Mm. So just coming back to your model of atmospheric jihadism. So, I mean, you mentioned that Mohammed Merah's attack was called like a lone wolf attack. I mean, to me, there's still a perception when we have these kind of low-tech attacks, whether it's a stabbing or a vehicle ramming or something like that, it kind of still gets thought of as, you know, we use kind of euphemisms like self-initiated self-starter or lone wolf or lone actor and things like that. And your theory, which I think I agree with, kind of that would say that that's quite a big oversimplification of what's happening, and actually it's kind of more that the European Islamist movement is coming of age it's more like a grassroots uprising of people who are already radical, rather than this idea of people, you know, on their online in their bedrooms and becoming radicalized and becoming a lone wolf. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this lone wolf, you know, characterization leads us nowhere. Is a misnomer. And actually, this when I sort of tried to build this concept, this notion of atmosphere or atmospheric jihadism, in French, jihadism d'atmosphère, something which I sort of started to write about after the Samuel Paty attack. Was due to the fact that, together with my colleague Bernard Rougier, whom you mentioned earlier on, who had worked on what he called those entrepreneurs of rage or entrepreneurs of woke, you know, he noticed that the internet was full of this stereotyping of enemies, of this like people who were identified as enemies of Islam, not only the Charlie Hebdo guys and so on and so forth, but, you know, this was something that was used to sort of mobilize under the banner of political Islamists masses of Muslims who were not necessarily favorable to those Islamists, but who thought they were being attacked. And then to whom Islamists would say, hey guys, we're the only ones who can fight for you. And, you know, this, when we get back a little to originally to Ayman al-Zawahiri and his famous manifesto, Knights with a K under the Prophet's banner, which was probably put online in 1996, 1997, his main question was, why have the masses not sided with us in Algeria, in Egypt, in Bosnia, or even in Chechnya? They did not side with us because they, you know, they did not identify with our jihad. And if we address the masses, if we say we fight in their name against the arrogant and the infidel West, then this is going to be much more efficient. And this was the aim of 9/11 to a large extent, you know, to make something spectacular so that the masses would not fear anymore. And this atmospheric jihadism is of the same mold to a large extent, except that entrepreneurs of rage have a sort of widespread message, which is not jihadist per se. It does not target people and say you have to kill them. This was ISIS. Like, for instance, you mentioned when I was targeted by an ISIS guy who had stabbed this policeman and his wife in the outskirts of Paris, and then he went on Facebook Live and said, "Hey guys, I'm going to be a martyr. My brothers, I stabbed the policeman and his wife. Now you have to kill all journalists," even though I would be ready to have martyrdom as an academic, not necessarily as a journalist, but this is another story. And then there was myself and a bunch of other people, including mostly journalists, who say you have to kill those guys. Now, this is not what we hear now. It's not kill this guy or this guy. It's the targeting, the focusing on people who insult Islam, who insult the prophets, and so on and so forth. And then naturally, it creates an atmosphere where a number of individuals are going to say, yes, I have to take things into my hands and to follow up the guidance of those people who have targeted so and so. And this is a much more complicated matter, because in the past, you know, security or police agencies would arrest someone or kill someone, find out that he was the accomplice of Mr. So-and-so, that he belonged to this organization, and so on and so forth. Now, there is this sort of cleavage of break between the entrepreneurs of rage on the one hand, and the actual murderers or killers. There is no real link between them. They have not exchanged messages on the internet. Palantir is of no use for that, you know. And it spreads through atmosphere to some extent in a viral way, just like COVID-19 spreads because of, you know, of the atmosphere, and because you breathe the little drops of whatever that someone who's infected disseminates. And this is the big issue, and this is why I believe Macron's aim with his speech on Islamist separatism meant that we have to move in a way upstream. The issue is not only to come after the fact, arrest someone who has been killed anyway, and discover that there is nothing to uncover because he has no one gave him an order, right? But rather to prevent, to use British parlance, to prevent this to happen in addressing this ideology that considers that, you know, on the one hand you have infidels and apostates, and on the other hand you have good believers, and that the other category has, as they say, they have their blood is licit, and hence they can be dehumanized and executed. And this is something which is an enormous challenge, because you know, passing legislation on that, as we are now doing in France, is definitely something that poses questions on, you know, where does liberty or freedom stop and where does security begin? And it's a very thin barrier, and it can be used by authoritarian regimes, of course. This is why this is something that has to be done under Parliament's scrutiny. But you know, like nowadays there is a legislation which is being passed on GAFA, so that you know, they are held accountable for the contents, the heinous contents on it. And you know, before they would say it's not us, you know, but as soon as they get the money from the exchanges and the chats on the web, therefore they can be held accountable. And by the same token, you know, unfortunately, because of COVID-19, one of the first liberties in democratic societies, i.e. the freedom to go wherever you want, has been suspended. So unfortunately, this atmospheric jihadism threat takes place into those other threats. It's something which is both the sort of, I should not say brainchild in the internet, because there is not much brain in that, and also of the new viral threats of the 21st century.
I'm just going to say to the people listening in, if you do have questions, do drop them in the chat. I can see a couple already. I'll come to them. So just on that idea of atmospheric jihadism and separatism as well. So, I mean, obviously you said like some of the recent attacks haven't been committed by, you know, out and out jihadists, people connected to jihadist groups. But even if you go back to the ISIS phenomenon, the exodus, if you will, I mean, it was well over 1,000 people went from France, I think. I think sorry?
10,000.
Oh, okay. There's some, I mean, some compelling research from your, like I said, from yourself, from Bernard Rouget, from Hugo Micheron as well. It kind of, it shows that there's already, and this comes back to what you were saying before about the loyalty and disavowal principle of the Salafists, that it shows that a lot of the people had already made the psychological break from French society. They'd already, that withdrawal from French society had already happened long before they joined ISIS. And I think Bernard Rouget uses a phrase. He says that they were already living in an imagined caliphate but ISIS turned it into an operational one. And I think on my side of the channel, sorry, go on.
You're right. Even if they were living in France, Britain, Belgium, or Germany, I mean, the boundaries were not so much physical boundaries as imaginary boundaries, definitely.
Mm. So that reality on the ground, I think, is something that we don't really understand in the Anglosphere, if I can say that crudely. I mean, I moved to Toulouse actually just after Mohammed Murat's attack, and I saw for myself the activists working on the ground in those neighborhoods. Relentless activism on the ground to try and to recruit and convert and proselytize, and I think we're missing from that. We still in the Anglosphere have this idea that these are like we said before, these lone wolves mobilized on the internet, whereas actually this is a lot more of a physical, territorial, environmental phenomenon. And I think that was reflected in the French Senate report as well, which talked about ecosystems, and this all fits into your model. I think the atmospheric jihadism model is that fair? That I think you have a more mature understanding in France.
Well, I don't know whether it's more mature or not, because also there are peculiarities of each European society, as you know, and the social fabric is not exactly similar. The political system is not always the same, but this definitely fits into I believe into the necessity to try to devise a new model for understanding the challenge. I mean, after intelligence agencies and networks understood that they had failed to understand that the ISIS thing, because they were still thinking of ISIS with the Al-Qaeda tools, if I can say so. Hence, they turned to Palantir, and they bought those software thing of encryption and to break the codes of Telegram and the like. And then they send the bomber fighters over the caliphate, which was extremely costly, which to some extent destroyed ISIS as a system, if I may say so, as a nizam, to use the Arabic word, but which is totally useless now, because you don't need the software, and you don't need the bomber fighters. I mean, you need to address Muslim minds as jihadists and as Islamists do. This is to a lot of challenge in the cultural level.
So it strikes me that your model, atmospheric jihadism, before I put a couple of questions from the audience to you, it strikes me this is a warning as much as a hypothesis, that actually we can't afford to be slow in reacting in the same way that we have been in the past.
Maybe, I mean, if it proves right, if it proves efficient, then that would mean that we have broken the code much sooner than we did with ISIS. Like Abu Musab al-Suri had sort of designed the model in 2005. His book, was out in 2005 in the internet, and it was not understood. I remember one time I was in London meeting with the Foreign Office, and there were some other people, of course, and they were aware of it, and they said, "Hey, it does not work. It's great because this bottom-up thing is a virus, and it will destroy Al-Qaeda from the inside." And they translated it into English immediately because they thought they could use it for their own purpose, which and it petered out. It did not work at all for their purpose, but it created a model that they could not understand. And then 8 years after, or 7 years after, in Toulouse, I mean, the French intelligence czar could not understand, could not identify, because it still had this Al-Qaeda in mind. So one of the issues, of course, for us is to try to say whether this is, we get the software of this new jihadism as it is emerging, not 5 years later, but this is a hypothesis to some extent. It has to, I stick to it, but well, it has to be checked and discussed, and there's going to be a trial and error process on it.
Well, I'm already more convinced by it than I am by the online vulnerable model that we have across the channel. I think there's a question. I think that we've kind of touched on this already, but asking about have you personally been targeted by these Islamist campaigns? And then the follow-up to that is, do you ever feel the need to self-censor as a result, or does that affect your work in any way?
On the contrary, because actually, when I was put under police protection for a year and a half, after I was sentenced to death by ISIS, by this guy in 2016, then it so happened that, you know, I got an old car from the police, which had the, you know, which was not very comfortable, and because of that, I had a terrible attack of sciatica. And I could not do anything but lay in bed. And the only thing I could do then was to put my laptop on my thighs. And this is how I wrote my book, Away from Chaos, lying in bed under jihadist threat, you know, because also it was a review of what I had done. So I looked at my life in retrospect, as I was now to be a martyr. And this, in a way, away from, I mean, so I did not censor myself at all, on the contrary. And I guess that, you know, the book was translated into 10 or something languages, and it's, I believe that it is now part and parcel of the debate on those issues. And there's this new book now, and none of them could be considered as self-censorship. I'm never into those issues of insulting others. Now, I'm trying to stay as I am. I'm a scholar, soon to retire actually, but for the time being, still a scholar of those issues. And I'm trying to suggest models for deciphering those phenomena and understanding them. And of course, as a scholar, I put them on the public markets, like we're doing now, and the people are free to criticize and to overcome. And you know, the progress of knowledge has to go through dialogue. And we do something, and then someone says, "I agree with this, but I don't agree with that," and then there's something else that's being done. Like I believe, like people like Bernard Rougier, who's slightly younger than I am, and Michon, who is really younger than I am, will probably embody the new generations, and they will discover things that I have not discovered, and hence history goes on, and so does social science, inshallah.
Inshallah. I was going to say, I think before you do leave us, if you're retiring, you need to radicalize a future generation with your writings and thoughts, definitely. And I love that. I mean, as if you need another reason to be angry at jihadists, they gave you sciatica as well. So
it was not really the jihadists; it was the old cars of the French police. Since then, you know, when I had access to some high ups in the French establishment, my first thing to say is, "What should we do?" And I always told them, you know, you have to entirely revamp the police cars, which is being done. I'm being said, not because of me, but because otherwise the cops would demonstrate.
So as well as your dozens of published books, that's your legacy as well. The next generation of police cars, brilliant. Jacob's asked about we will wrap up in a minute. Jacob's asked about how far back in history do we need to go to properly understand and situate contemporary jihadism? I know you talk in terms of generations, and I think you would say we're on the 4th generation of jihadism now. But how far back do we need to go back further than that?
4G, if I say so.
4G.
But you know, it goes with the changes in digital culture, definitely. I mean, it goes parallel. No, I think we have to go. The Away from Chaos book goes back to 1973, to the Ramadan War, and this is where it all started. You know? With the first wave of jihad starting after the Soviet, significantly on a large scale, starting after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in Christmas Day 1979. And then you had phase one, Afghanistan, and then which worked, and then the copycat jihads in Egypt, Syria in the 1990s, which did not work. Then phase two, sort of negation, which is lessons learned by Al-Qaeda, focus on the faraway enemy, which worked to an extent in terms of propaganda, but they were not able to build a state to seize power. And then phase three, the two AbuSabhas, As-Suri and Zarqawi, whose thought would coalesce instead of themselves. It's in the sort of the way their followers implemented it into ISIS or Daesh, as they say in Arabic and we say in French. Daesh fell with the fall of their pseudo caliphate in 2017, and then finally 2019. And now we're definitely, I believe, in the fourth generation, which is learning the lessons from the failures of ISIS. This is how I would, in a nutshell, sort of identify the challenge.
Right, one final question, and I guess it kind of wraps up some of the themes that we've talked about. So the campaign against Samuel Paty, and we saw subsequent campaigns against educators in particular, excuse me, they've crossed the channel to some extent. We've seen campaigns against university lecturers and a school teacher in West Yorkshire in the UK. It seems to me, and this is a question from Paul, it seems to both of us, I think, that France is much more up for that fight, whereas there's a bit of moral confusion over the issue of blasphemy, and to be seen to be defending the right for these people not to be targeted or killed is to be seen to be defending offending people. So I mean, take that how you will, but are there any observable differences for why France is kind of more able to have that, that, like you said, cultural battle?
This sort of blame the victim culture that you mentioned, of course. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier on about this cultural model of universal assimilation, whereas what we have in common, I guess in the mainstream French cultural worldview, is more important than our differences. And it's not only an issue of Muslims or non-Muslims. When you're a united kingdom, it means that you are not, as we know now, as the joke goes, it's untied rather than united. You just switch the T and the I, where between, and you don't know whether Scotland is still going to be part of Britain after the next referendum. We're considering, of course, having it part of France, because the links between the Scots and the French tracing back to American the Scots. But the sort of unicity of the Republic, even though it has its downside, I believe is much more ingrained probably in French political culture than it may be in a united kingdom or in other countries like Germany, where the Länder are so important, or even in Italy. So this also has to do with political culture.
Thank you. Well, I think that's it. We've taken 6 minutes more of your time than I promised. So I know you're a very busy man, and I know you're doing another English engagement later as well. So thank you so much for that. For anybody who didn't catch any of that or joined late, it's going to go straight on YouTube because we're still live streaming now. So the copy will be available straight away. Professor Kepel's latest essay, the Murder of Samuel Paty, is available. You might be able to make it out in Liberties, the new journal that's on his shelf there, in Liberties Journal. So just Google that, and I've read it and would thoroughly recommend it. And I think it basically covers just about everything that we've talked about today, which is fantastic. And obviously you can go in a lot more depth in an essay. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and we'll